It's time for us to check back in with the thread that runs so true. If you've missed any of the previous readings, just look in the description below for a playlist. Before I went to Maxwell High School as principal, Charles Manson had told me that probably the only difficult problem I would have there would be Maxwell High School versus community. He said if the school won the fight, there would be a fine community of citizens in the west end of Greenwood County someday, but if the school lost the fight, it might take the community a long time to shake off ignorance and superstition. At first it looked as though the community might win. At our football games, men from the steel mills and shoe factories in Dartmouth, who had made twice as much money as the teachers, refused to pay our small admission fees. They forced their way in. When boys saw older men doing this, they did likewise. There were too many of them for us to handle without the help of the county sheriff and his deputies. When the basketball season began, even though we were inside, we were unable to keep these people from coming in through doors and windows. A crowd would overpower the pupils who tried to stand guard. I notified Deputy Sheriff Bill Windsor, and for 3 nights he came to help. Then he said he missed his sleep and could not guard the schoolhouse every time we had a basketball game. Coach Myers thought of an idea to stop the intrusions. He stapled large chains to the walls inside, put a staple in the door, and fastened the chains to the staple with a padlock. Before a game or a school program, we checked every window to see if it was locked, but our windows were broken and our doors were pounded and kicked until the panels were broken. I saw my students fight to keep their school building from being destroyed. They took pride in the building. Before this had been built, they had had to attend school in a building a little better than an ordinary Kentucky barn. We continued to be harassed by outsiders, however, until April of my first year there. On this April evening, we were presenting an operetta under the supervision of Miss Thalia Myers. About 100 pupils were taking part in it, and we had advertised it widely in the local papers. People came from Dartmouth and Landsboro and other sections, and all the seats in the auditorium were filled. Every available chair was brought from the classrooms. I had asked Sheriff Windsor to come, but he told me he couldn't. Some minutes before curtain time, I saw 2 men sitting behind me wearing broad-brimmed cowboy hats. I went back and asked them if they would remove them so that people sitting behind them could see. They mumbled something and removed their hats, but before I got back to my seat, the women sitting in front of them got up and moved to back seats. The men had been putting the toes of their shoes in the open space between the chair seats and backs. I knew they were here to make trouble, and I asked them to do us the favor of leaving before the operetta started. They said they would leave if they could have their money back, and Mrs. Laird, who had been taking tickets, came over and told me they had forced their way in without paying. I told her to pay them, and they arose, cursing the school, the teachers and pupils, and everyone in the audience. At the door, one turned and shouted obscene words that I had often watched from Lonesome Valley's outdoor privy walls. A silence fell over the audience. I left my coat in my chair and went outside. I had decided that if there was no law to protect us, it was time we began to protect ourselves. A young fellow who didn't look to weigh more than 135 pounds followed me out. The 2 men were standing there in the moonlight. "Why are you coming out here, you educated SOB?" the larger man asked me as he started to put his hand in his pocket. "I'll show you." But his hand did not quite reach his pocket, and he didn't finish his sentence. I caught him on the chin with a haymaker that really connected. I put all of my 222 pounds behind it. If we had been in the ring, he would have gone over the ropes, not under or through them. I lifted him over the row of spirea that grew behind the schoolhouse, and he slumped against the wall. Pains shot from my hand to my shoulder. Now the other man started for me, and the little man who had followed me out tied into him. When I turned, I saw Coach Myers coming out, and with him was Robert Wigglesworth, the county's agricultural agent. They immediately decided to phone the sheriff. By the time he arrived, the man I had hit was just coming to his senses, and the second man had been whipped by my small friend. During all this time, the operetta was going on smoothly. The audience didn't know what went on outside the schoolhouse until they read it in the papers the next day. Superintendent Manson sent for me to come to Lansboro. "Mr. Stuart," he said, laying 3 newspaper clippings before me, "this is bad publicity for Maxwell High School, for the Greenwood County school system, for me, and for you. Schoolmen shouldn't fight." "Only if they're forced to fight," I said. "I was forced to fight. We can't get protection from the law. I've reported this more than once to you." I told him what this man had said when he left the auditorium, and that every man, woman, and child had heard it. "This Bascom Riffet you hit is from a fighting family," he said. "They are on the dangerous side. You may have a lot more trouble with him." "I know we will if he comes back to Maxwell High School and tries to repeat what he did and said last night," I replied. "Now I want you to know I am back of you," Mr. Manson said, "but I don't believe in members of the teaching profession fighting. You fractured his jaw, broke 2 molars off even with the gums, and loosened 2 more. I've already heard his side of the story. I'm glad he can't be considered a boy. He lacks only a year being as old as you, and is only 20 pounds under your size. This will be in your favor when it gets to court." Then he continued more softly, "I'm going to do all I can to see that your trial is postponed from one term of court to another. Just don't have any more fights like this one." I was never tried for assault and battery. It took Bascom Riffet more than a year to cool off and to be my friend. Mr. Manson and I did not know that this April night was the turning point in our fight against the ruffians of the community. From that time on, we were not bothered. This was big news in Farlington, and it circulated to the people living in the valleys and hollows and on the hills and ridges. Our candle burned brighter in the community because we had fought for our own self-respect and for our belief in the cause for which we stood, the cause of right. In my second year at Maxwell High School, something happened about an injustice I had fought against with every ounce of mental and physical strength I had when I was superintendent of Greenwood County Schools. All I had written then against it was now cold ashes, supplementing nourishment to the roots of our pasture grass. Perhaps a few of the letters and the spoken words had lived and had some effect, but the main reason for it was the mounting death toll every time there was an election. Legislation permitting the abolishment of sub-districts, thereby doing away with the trustee system. I read these unbelievable words carefully. This was the catch: legislation permitting. In other words, this piece of legislation threw the responsibility for doing away with the sub-districts and the school trustee system directly upon the county school superintendents and the members of their boards of education. The state lawmakers didn't assume the responsibility, and here is what happened. After this legislation was passed, Charles Manson, superintendent of Greenwood County Schools, called a special session of his board, and they did away with the trustee system. Of the 120 counties in Kentucky, Greenwood County was the first to do this. If Charles Manson had had the school board I had when I was superintendent of Greenwood County Schools, it would not have been done. They would have voted against it. But Mr. Manson was fortunate enough to have on his board 3 young men who were high school graduates. I had taught these young men in Lansboro High School, and even in those days we discussed the school problems, especially the trustee system of our state. One of these young board members was Walter Harrison, son of Fred Harrison of the Samaria School District, and Fred Harrison and Rodney Norton were still locked in legal combat over a school trustee election when Fred Harrison beat Rodney Norton. Years were passing, but the fight was still going on. Charles Manson and his school board members were threatened with reprisals, but Charles Manson was diplomatic enough to call the trustees local advisors and leave them in each district. However, they were left without power. Thus ended, for us, a school system worthy of the dark ages. In many sections of the state, when county school superintendents and members of their school boards tried to do away with the system, they were faced with problems. Darter County, which joins Greenwood County, voted the trustee system out, but this started a young war. The fight was so intense they had to return to the system. Other counties gradually eliminated it. Not all. Even today, 17 of our 120 counties still hold to it. Later came more important pieces of legislation. Teachers' tenure law was passed. Then came the teachers' retirement law with the highest monthly allotment of $100 and the lowest of $8.33 per month going to teachers too old to teach school any longer. This law came to benefit the school teachers in my state long after railway section men were drawing their old age pensions. My father was one of them. He was retired on physical disability. Even he, though he could not read or write, could not understand why teachers too old to teach had not been given pensions long ago. For many years, I had blamed the members of the State Department of Education for our standing second from the bottom in education of all the 48 states in this republic. After much reading and investigating the facts, I learned that members of our State Department of Education had to obey the laws created by the state's lawmakers. The shocking thing I learned was that the Superintendent of Public Instruction, the highest education office in our state, drew only $4,000 a year, while the superintendent of one of the small independent city schools systems in Greenwood County drew $4,200 a year. This injustice made me feel desperately for the men of my State Department of Education, grooved in the tightening clutch of law and fighting an uphill battle. Even in Kentucky, we have a law that will not permit any state official to make more than $5,000 a year. This includes the president of the University of Kentucky. Coach Myers, Vernon Madden, and Charles Watson came to my office to discuss what we were going to do with Tootle Powell. Tootle was the best fullback in Maxwell High School's football history. He weighed only 156 pounds. This small, bow-legged, broad-shouldered boy with a head of shaggy, coarse black hair could punt, pass, carry a ball, block, and tackle. But Tootle Powell had a serious fault. Every time he tackled a man, he would bite like a dog. "Look what he gave me down on the field a while ago," Coach said, pulling up his pant leg. "Bit me through all that padding." There was a big red spot on Coach Myers' leg, just above his knee, and there was in this red spot the print of a full set of teeth. "See, we divided the team to have a little skirmish," Coach explained. "When I started through with the ball, Tootle upended me with a shoestring tackle. Then he socked his teeth in my leg. I screamed and he let loose. Then he apologized. But you know, Mr. Stewart," Coach admitted, "apologies are not worth a hoot in a football game. When a player lets out a scream, like a lot of them have, that Tootle has tackled, the referee gets us for roughing the game." "I've been bitten by 3 dogs in my lifetime," Vernon Madden admitted, "but not one of them bit me as hard as Tootle Powell did the other afternoon when I skirmished on the side against the coach." "Look here," grinned Charles Watson, pulling his pant leg. "He bit me last week. See the print of his teeth still there?" "See, Mr. Stewart," Coach Myers said, "we have more yardage and penalties than any team in the OK football conference. Tootle bites so hard sometimes he makes the man drop the ball. It's happened a lot of times. Of course, it looks bad for the school, and it looks bad for me, the coach. That's why we've not won a game. Yet if I lose this man, there's not a chance of our winning a game this year. He's a fine boy and a wonderful football player if he just didn't have that awful habit." "Have you talked to him about it?" I said. "I've lectured him every day at practice," Coach answered. "He says he can't help it. I don't believe he can. I don't believe Toodle Pal wants to bite anybody. I suggested to Coach Myers that we get rubber pads and put them over his teeth, Vernon Madden said, but Coach doesn't think it'll work. Looks like we could do something, Charlie Watson said. I've lain awake at night, Coach Myers said, and tried to think what to do with him. See, we've got to play Lanesboro High School this Friday. Since we've not won a game this season, I'd like for us to win or tie this game if we could. Lanesboro's not lost a game, and we've not won a game. I need Toodle in this game. Do you reckon I'd have any influence if I talked to him, I asked. Not one bit, Coach Myers said. Talking doesn't do any good. Then we'll have to cover his mouth with something, I suggested. I have it, Vernon Madden shouted. What about using a baseball catcher's mask? But how about keeping it on him, Coach Myers asked. Use adhesive tape, Charlie Watson said. Strap it to his headgear. But how could we explain a football fullback in a lineup with a catcher's mask taped to his headgear, Coach asked. Couldn't we put a patch or two on his nose as if he had hurt it, I suggested. We could, Charlie Watson said. Well, looks like that might work, Coach Myers smiled. Coach, I can fix the gear for Toodle, Vernon Madden said. I know just what you want. I'll go fix it right away. If only it will work, Coach Myers said, for he was still skeptical. While Vernon worked in the athletic room, combining the headgear and the baseball catcher's mask, I went down to the athletic field to watch the team practice. Toodle had been pulled out and was sitting alone on the bench. Get back in there, Toodle, Coach Myers shouted. We're going to use you. We're not putting you off the team. When the two lines clashed, I watched Sid Callahan start around the end with the ball, and I saw Toodle miss two would-be blockers and make for Sid. Sid thought he had an open field, but Toodle picked him up from the rear with a long plunge through the air and a perfect tackle below the knees. When he tackled, I saw him grab Sid's leg and hold on like a bulldog. Sid screamed. See what I've been telling you about, Coach said? And when he bites, believe me, you are bitten. I'm sorry, Sid, Toodle said, helping Sid up from the ground and putting his arm around his shoulder. Honest, I couldn't help it. Sid didn't say anything. He limped back across the field where his men were forming a huddle. Toodle Pal didn't go back into the skirmish. He sat on the bench until Vernon Madden and Coach Myers put his mask headgear combination on Toodle and strapped it behind. Then Coach put Toodle back into the skirmish, and it worked. When Toodle tackled and the boys piled up, we didn't see one flop from the pile like a fish on dry land and hear him let out a wild scream. Toodle nuzzled them with his mask like a horse with a muzzle trying to get green corn. Boy, am I proud, Coach Myers said. And fellows, am I glad, Sid Callahan said. Then his teammates sang, Coach has found a way, Toodle will get to play. Oh my goodness, what a story. We'll stop right there for today. What a funny place to stop. Oh my goodness, Toodle and his biting. Oh gracious. Well, the part that I read today is more of Jesse's just crazy life experiences that he shared. We'll start with when he's there at Maxwell High School. If you remember last time, and maybe even the last time, I can't remember how many times we've read about it, but what a beautiful school it was and how nice it was and how modern and all that. But then he's got these men at the beginning of this part breaking in the windows and the doors that don't want to pay. They don't want to pay the admission fee to go to the basketball games. And then at the football games, I guess they're not breaking anything. They're just showing up and not paying. And of course we know even in those days, just like today, schools use that money to fund maybe the athletic department, but maybe even other stuff. So he had a real problem there. And especially when they were the two men at the operetta that they had, when they were behaving like that, you know, they were putting their feet on the women there, and then they were cussing and screaming, and just hard to imagine that people would act like that. They were just being really mean, you know, really, really terrible. Really hard to believe. that anyone would act like that. But I guess maybe they just thought they had the right. They just thought, you can't make me pay. I have the right, I guess. I don't know. I don't know about the being mean, though, and the cussing and the screaming part. But then Jesse, like we've read during the book and other places, he just had enough finally, and he said, I'm just going to have to go handle this myself. And so he went and he, used his haymaker and put Bascom on his back over there, and then his friend took care of the other man, and they really whipped him. And if you remember, it's several different times when things like this has happened, Jesse said people respected that in those days. They respected toughness, they respected it that he was able to whip whoever it was that was bothering them, and then usually his problem would go away. That was something they really respected. Now it looks like that same respect would work in the other way against those men that were breaking in, not paying, that it would work in the other way, and you would disrespect them to the point they would quit. I don't know. But Jesse's made mention of that several times, that they really respected the force, just the brute force that he would have to employ in certain situations. So really interesting, and hard for us to even imagine today something like that happening. And then the next little part he talked about, finally, hallelujah. I'm sure he was shouting all over the place. He was so happy that the trustee system, at least in Greenwood County, was gone. It was done away with. The legislators, like he was saying, they didn't fully go all the way, because they said basically they were going to leave it up to each little individual district. And at the time of him writing this, some of them still had it. Of course, today that's long since been gone, but this book was written, many, many, many years ago. But that Jesse was really happy about that, and really happy that Manson agreed with him. I do think it's interesting. Him and Manson, he says, got along, and they agreed on so many different things, his superintendent now. But he did kind of get on to Jesse about fighting. But I don't really see that there was any other option for Jesse to do other than fight and Bascom, but that part was interesting. But I loved when he was talking about the trustees, about how that had gone, he had waited so long for that to happen. But remember, he'd wrote all those articles, and he'd sent them mostly to the papers and the magazines and stuff in Kentucky, and none of them had been accepted. Nobody would publish them. And then remember, he'd took them to up by the big rock in his father's pasture, and he'd burned all that stuff. So I loved here he says the cold ashes, talking about those things he'd written, supplementing nourishment to the roots of our pasture grass, that's where all the things he'd written about, they were turned into ashes and were now nourishing the soil up there. But that he was glad this had finally happened. And I know he was glad, especially that Manson went along with it, that he stood up, and that he had the school board in place at that time, that agreed with him and stood up and said, no more trustees. Manson was a real smart man, though. Then he said, well, just to kind of smooth people's feathers, said they could be local advisors. So instead of getting to do every detail, they could just advise. And really that, like Jesse said, that took their power away, and then that probably just fizzled out, and they didn't care nothing about advising someone that wasn't going to listen to them. And again, when he, as he was talking about the part where when he wrote the book, there was still 17 counties that still had the trustee system. Makes you wonder at that point, I guess people still lived with them. The teacher still lived with the trustee, maybe, or maybe that part had changed, but still the trustee was just kind of over the school. Because remember, these are such rural, remote places that it was a long way from the superintendent. Remember, they only visited one time a year, if that. Jesse made sure he did, but so that's interesting. Something to consider when you think about keeping the trustee system. But I loved how he described that one county, nearby county, that they also voted, they voted to do away with it, but then it got so bad. It was so bad that they had to go back to it because people were so unhappy. But he called it a young war. It started a young war. I love that phrase. I really don't hear anybody use, it's not the young war part, not that I want it to be a war or anything, but I love the young part of that. I've heard a young Noah talking about a big, a flood, not really a flood to the extent, of course, something terrible, horrible like what's happened with Helene, but maybe just a little bit of flooding, called a young Noah. Then if you remember, I think it was the last reading, he talked about a young wind in the spring. So all those ways of putting young with the wind, the Noah, or here, the war, just means it wasn't a full-blown one, a full-growed one. We would say a full-grown one, if you would, whether it was flood or the war or whatever, but just a small one, just a little one. So I love that, young war. And, you know, I can't even think about a young Noah without thinking about Kenneth Roper, because he used to say that, a young Noah. So I thought that was really, really interesting. And then the other part, of course, when he's talking about all that, this was way back then, as is that when he was talking about how much, you know, no one could make above the $5,000 or whatever it was. That would have been, of course, in those days, nothing like that today. Makes you wonder at what point that changed and they done away with that. Be interesting, especially if you were in Kentucky, to go back and find that out. And then, of course, the end, Tootle Powell. How crazy. He just would get so, I guess, so excited he couldn't help but bite. So he was biting. Every time he'd tackle somebody, he'd bite. But he was an excellent football player, so they needed to keep him. They couldn't just get rid of him. If he'd been a bad football player, they just said, you're off the team. But they needed him because he was the best player. Reminded me of him, the way he was biting, when Corey and Katie were just little toddlers. I mean, you know, just little bitty. Maybe 2 years old, a year old or something. And you know how when kids are that little and you're hugging them and tickling them and talking to them and just playing with them and, you know, tickling and laughing. They both would do that. They just get so excited laughing that they might just clamp down on you somewhere, usually your shoulder or your arm. And it would make you so mad you couldn't stand it, because it hurt, you know, but they didn't even realize they were doing it. It was just kind of in a frenzy, like while they were laughing and cutting up. And of course, they didn't do it for long. It was just a little spell there, and then they began to understand, you can't do that, can't bite mama or daddy. But that's what it reminded me of. I guess Tootle was just so exuberant when he would make those tackles that he just bit. And he says, I can't help it. Seems, of course, to us crazy that a teenager couldn't help himself from biting somebody. Doesn't even make sense, but really funny. I'm sure it wasn't funny to the people who was getting bit, but really funny for us and humorous. And then, of course, how they come up with to stop him, just to make it where he couldn't bite, and then he was just still trying, but not actually biting them. So that's all I can say at this point is that I could only imagine that whole scenario happening in Jesse Stuart's life, because he's had some interesting things happen to him. So it fits perfectly with the rest of it. I hope you'll leave a comment and tell me what you enjoyed about this part. And as always, I hope you'll drop back by next Friday. We're getting really close to the end. I guess I know we've got at least one more reading, but I guess we've got, now that I look, I guess we've got a few more readings, but we're getting closer and closer to the end, so please do drop back by next Friday.